Welcome back, everybody. Today we're going to be taking a deep dive into something that you might not think is very exciting, but I think we can all agree is pretty fundamental to pretty much everything. Counting.
You got that right.
Yeah, and to help us with this deep dive, we're going to be looking at an article from August 2001 by William L. Weaver. And it's really fascinating to see how some of the things that he was talking about way back then are still so relevant today.
Absolutely. I mean, counting is everywhere, right? Like, it's not just something we learn in elementary school. It's like the basis of so much of our technology and our world today. I mean, you think about all the data that's being collected, think like things like, website traffic or scientific measurements, radiation levels, even, elections.
Yeah.
All of that depends on accurate counting.
Right. And what's funny is that the word tally actually comes from the Latin word for twig.
Oh, really?
Yeah, so you can imagine, like, our ancestors just, making little notches on twigs to keep track of, like, how many sheep they had or, how many days had passed.
Wow.
It's kind of like the original, counting system.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I mean, it's like a reminder that humans have always had this need to, quantify and measure the world around them. And it's amazing to think how far we've come, from those simple tally marks to the complex digital systems we have today.
Yeah, well, and speaking of tally marks, you know how they have that, like, 4 lines and then the diagonal slash across?
Yeah.
It's based on, like, a 5-base system.
Right.
Like 5 fingers on our hand.
Right.
And that system, it's not just some ancient thing. It's actually built into technology we use all the time. Like, think about the odometer in your car.
Oh, yeah, that's a great example.
As each wheel turns over, it represents like a different place value.
Right. It's like a physical representation of our number system.
Exactly.
Like when that odometer clicks over to the next digit, it's like that mechanical carryover is essentially the same principle as, how we add numbers in our heads.
Yeah, and it's amazing how those, like, really basic ideas from the past are still so relevant today. But things start to get even more interesting, I think, when we move into the world of electronics.
Yeah.
Weaver talks about this invention called the flip-flop circuit. Originally it was called a B-stable multivibrator, which just sounds really complicated.
A mouthful.
Yeah, but the concept is actually pretty cool.
Yeah, so essentially a flip-flop is like a tiny electronic switch that can remember one of 2 states.
Okay.
So on or off.
Okay.
Which we represent as 1 or 0.
Ah, so this is where binary code comes in, right?
Exactly.
Like the language of computers.
Exactly. Binary is a system that uses only 2 digits, 0 and 1, to represent all numbers and data. And this flip-flop circuit, which was actually invented way back in 1919, became like the building block for early computer memory. Because it could store these binary values. Of course, back then they were still using these bulky vacuum tubes.
Oh, yeah.
But the flip-flop itself was this really groundbreaking invention.
I mean, it's just wild to think about those early computers, like rooms full of these glowing tubes.
Oh, yeah.
And all that just to do, like, basic calculations.
It's amazing.
But Weaver, he points out that the real game changer was the invention of the transistor in the 1950s.
Oh, absolutely.
These tiny devices, they replaced those giant vacuum tubes and really paved the way for the miniaturization of electronics.
Yeah, the transistor was revolutionary. I mean, it allowed us to pack billions of these tiny switches onto a single computer chip, which is mind-boggling when you think about it.
Yeah, it's amazing how innovation just kind of builds upon itself, like each breakthrough leads to new possibilities.
Yeah, and opens up entirely new fields of exploration.
Right. So we've got these flip-flops. They can be on or off, representing 1s and 0s. But how do we actually go from, like, a single flip-flop to counting large numbers? Like, how does my phone know how many steps I've taken today?
That's where it gets really clever. Weaver explains that you can connect multiple flip-flops together to build what are called counters.
Okay.
And these counters can handle much larger numbers. So it's like, imagine if you had, like, light switches.
Okay.
Right? And you linked them together. Each flip-flop represents a different place value, just like the digits in our number system.
So wait, are there different types of counters?
There are, yeah. And the difference is really about speed. So you have asynchronous counters, which are kind of like a relay race where each flip-flop passes the baton to the next one.
Okay.
But for real speed, you need what's called a synchronous counter, where all the flip-flops get the signal at the same time.
So it's like a perfectly choreographed dance.
Exactly.
Everyone moving in sync.
Yeah, and that's what allows our computers and our phones to process information at the incredible speeds that we're used to.
So from, like, counting votes to crunching numbers in a spreadsheet, It all comes back to these fundamental concepts of counting
Yeah.
and binary code.
Mm.
And it's all made possible by this tiny little flip-flop circuit.
It is amazing. And I mean, you think about it, Weaver was writing about all this back in 2001.
Right.
It really makes you wonder what he would think about the advancements we've seen since then.
Yeah. I mean, we've gone from those early transistors to chips with like billions of transistors,
Billions.
all working together at unimaginable speeds. It's really mind-blowing. But, his article, it gives us this glimpse into how we got here,
Right.
and it really makes you appreciate all the ingenuity and all the persistence of the people who have, built this incredible digital world that we live in.
Mm-hmm.
And he actually goes on to explain how a counter can be transformed into a timer,
Oh, yeah.
like the kind that makes your microwave beep or tells you how long you've been on that phone call.
So how do we go from counting to timing?
Well, just imagine you have a counter and you have a signal that pulses at a very precise rate, like once every second.
Okay.
By connecting that signal to the counter, you can essentially count the seconds.
Huh.
And that's the basic principle of a timer.
So it's like a metronome.
Exactly.
But instead of clicks, it's counting these electronic pulses. Exactly. And each pulse from the clock signal advances the counter by 1.
That's pretty cool.
And just like a metronome, you can speed it up, slow it down, adjust the frequency of that clock signal to create timers that measure different units of time, milliseconds, minutes, even hours.
Okay, that makes sense. But it's not just about counting up, right? Weaver mentions counting down as well. Like, how does that work? Like, how does the timer on my oven know when to stop cooking my pizza?
It all has to do with the logic circuits. You can have the counter increment with each pulse counting up or decrement counting down.
So my oven timer is basically counting down from, let's say, 20 minutes to 0, using that super accurate clock signal to make sure it hits 0 at the right time. It's amazing how much, complexity there is in just a simple kitchen appliance.
Yeah, and that principle of counting up or down, you see it in so many things we use every day, like a stopwatch.
Oh, yeah.
It's counting up from 0 to, time a race, or the countdown timer on your phone that's counting down to remind you to, take something out of the oven, hopefully before it burns.
Okay, so I'm seeing how those simple counters and towers are, everywhere. But Weaver also talks about something called a frequency counter. What is that?
So a frequency counter, it's a way to measure how often something happens within a certain amount of time.
Okay.
So, for example, it could measure how many times a button is pressed per second or how many waves pass a certain point.
So it's not just measuring time, but how many events happen within a specific time.
Exactly. And it's still based on that same idea of a counter driven by a clock signal. But instead of just counting time, it's counting how many times something happens while the clock is ticking.
So a frequency counter could measure, say, the frequency of a sound wave, like how many waves pass a microphone per second, and that determines the pitch of the sound.
Exactly, you got it. And the same principle is used in all sorts of applications, like measuring the speed of a rotating engine, analyzing radio signals.
It's amazing how versatile these counters and timers are. We've gone from tallying on twigs to these sophisticated electronic circuits that can measure time with such incredible precision and track events happening at, lightning speed.
It is. And remember, Weaver was describing all this back in 2001.
I know, it's crazy.
It's incredible to think about how far technology has come since then.
It really makes you wonder, where do we go from here?
Yeah.
I mean, if we've come this far in just a couple of decades, what might be possible in the next 20 years?
That's the question, isn't it? And while I don't have a crystal ball, I think it's safe to say that these fundamental concepts of counting and timing, they're going to continue to play a crucial role in shaping the future. We're already seeing incredible advancements in miniaturization,
Right.
with transistors getting smaller and more powerful every year.
So even tinier chips with even more computing power, what could that lead to?
I mean, imagine sensors that can measure time intervals with mind-blowing accuracy, or computers that can perform trillions of calculations per second. These advancements could revolutionize fields like scientific, research medicine communications.
It's like we're on the verge of a whole new era of precision and control, all thanks to these, incredibly precise counters and timers working behind the scenes.
Exactly. And as these technologies continue to evolve, they'll open up entirely new possibilities that we can't even imagine. Yet, it's an exciting time to be alive.
Yeah, it really is mind-blowing to think how far we've come from, those simple ideas of counting and timing, like from tally marks to measuring time in nanoseconds.
It really is an incredible journey.
Yeah.
And, as we keep going, into this world of ultra-precise measurement, it's not just about the technology itself, right? It's about understanding how these advancements could actually impact our lives.
Right, like more precision, more data isn't always a good thing, right?
Exactly. I mean, as we gain the ability to measure and analyze things, with ever-increasing precision, we need to think about the potential downsides as well.
Yeah, like what if you had sensors that could track your every move, your every heartbeat, even your brain waves?
It's a little creepy.
Yeah.
I mean, that level of monitoring it could be incredibly invasive, and it raises serious privacy concerns.
Right, it's kind of a double-edged sword.
Yeah.
Like, on the one hand, this data could be incredibly valuable for medical research, personalized healthcare.
Sure.
But on the other hand, it could also be used to manipulate or control people.
Absolutely. And it's not just about individual privacy either, right? I mean, as we collect more and more data about everything, traffic patterns, energy consumption, social interactions, it becomes possible to create these really detailed models and predictions about human behavior.
And while that could be used for good,
Of course.
it also makes you wonder about, free will and autonomy.
Yeah, it's like entering a world where algorithms can predict our actions before we even make them.
Right, and that's a little unsettling.
It is a complex issue, for sure, with no easy answers, but it's a conversation we need to be having as a society as these technologies become more powerful.
So we need to figure out some ethical guidelines and safeguards.
Exactly, to make sure that they're used responsibly and that they benefit humanity.
All right, so as we're wrapping up this deep dive into the world of counting and timing, I think it's clear that we're dealing with much more than just numbers here.
Absolutely.
It's about understanding the impact that these concepts have had on, our technological progress and thinking about the implications as we keep pushing the boundaries of what's possible.
And I think the most important takeaway for our listeners is this. As we're marveling at all this ingenuity and all this technology, let's not forget to think critically about the impact it could have,
Yeah,
Let's try to shape a future where technology serves humanity, not the other way around.
that's a great point. And to our listeners, we encourage you to keep exploring these topics and keep thinking about these important questions. Because the future is not something that just happens to us.
Yeah.
We create it together.
Exactly. And who knows what incredible innovations are out there waiting to be discovered, as we continue to count on innovation, both in our technology and, in how we think about these things.
Well said. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
We'll see you next time for another fascinating exploration.